Yeah, baby. Welcome to the Sixers Talk podcast. So glad you could join us. Danny Pommel, Noah Levick, Ben Berry, our producer extraordinaire in the cut on this podcast. And we are learning things about this 76ers team. And I'm not sure if we're going to get the answers that we want, but we got to take it for what it is. Noah, we have seen the Sixers face the two Eastern Conference and Western Conference champions in back-to-back games. They have not won one of these games. They've sunk into fourth in the standings, a game and a half back of first. There is less than 2 weeks left in the season. They're trying to figure some things out. And the thing that I'm really leaning on is because I feel like there's a bunch of ways you can look at this. And we'll get into James Harden's comments after the game yesterday and some interesting thoughts between a conversation of him and Doc Rivers. But no, there's different ways you can look at it. I'm hoping that there is a silver lining of them figuring some things out. And I'm hoping that these growing pains and these hiccups and these blown leads are leading to something. That Doc Rivers is setting this team up to be successful by putting them through a gauntlet and determining who he can depend on and who he can't and what lineups work. And I hope this tinkering leads to something. Do you feel me on that?
I do. I think, look, they've got 7 games left and the easiest remaining schedule in the NBA. So I don't think dropping 2 in a row to excellent ball clubs is a great concern. I think they are figuring some stuff out in terms of play style, in terms of Harden embracing that he needs to attack, he needs to draw free throws, needs to put pressure on the paint. But I think they're also learning that they weren't fully aware of all their weak spots or all the areas where they're not yet fully comfortable. One small example of that for me is prior to these last couple matchups, opponents had been mostly blitzing, hard hedging James Harden in the pick and roll, understandably try to get him to relinquish the ball. But we've seen how dangerous that combination is with him and Joel Embiid. And Milwaukee and Phoenix actually switched that a good amount. So you saw big guys defending James Harden on the perimeter. And I don't think the Sixers overall handled that badly, but I think there is significant room to grow there as far as decisively attacking it and just Harden and Embiid making the right reads and being on the same page time after time. So one good option, of course, on paper is just toss the ball into Joel Embiid at the nail, and he's facing a 6'3" guy like Drew Holiday. Sounds great and probably is going to produce some good looks, but it's new. Joel Embiid isn't familiar with someone who's not 7 feet tall guarding him. And it's one of these little nuances where the Sixers just don't have much time left to hone in on how to make this all work. But yeah, I think overall, the 2 losses in isolation are not a deep cause for concern, but they showed us even a tad more of what remains for this team to check off before the playoffs.
I'm a big guy on it's not a loss if you learn something. You know what I'm saying? So it's not necessarily a loss, it's a lesson. And it seems like you said the lessons the Sixers are going to have to learn are starting to I'm a big list guy. I like to actually have like a hardcore list, and then because I love crossing things off the list, like checking things off that are completed. So the list is getting longer for the 76ers, and something that spoke to that were James Harden's comments after the game, and we'll get to those. But it's just that I'm hoping that like I said, this all leads to something. And the Sixers don't have to play perfect basketball to beat these teams, these upper echelon teams. We've seen them beat the Bucks. We've seen them, play the Phoenix Suns really tight. We've seen them overcome the Miami Heat and, beat the Celtics and whatnot. So they don't have to play perfect basketball. And Doc Rivers doesn't have to coach a perfect game, but they have to make the right moves and the right decisions at the right time. And I think they're coming into that. They're starting to develop, some of those consistencies that will lead them to, winning basketball. And I'm not infatuated with, where they are in the standings and who they face in the first and second round. Hey, I would love to have, an easy go of it into the Eastern Conference Finals, but that's kind of wishful thinking and a pipe dream in a way, because I'm just looking for them to just take care of their own front porch and continue to win and play consistently and grow together. And when you listen to them talk, you hear that, and particularly, when you look at the way things translate onto the court, you see progress in some areas, but then you see things, dip back in others. I think Matisse Thybulle would be a great example of that. They love his defense, but his offense just isn't coming around. So you have a game like last night where he only attempts a single shot. He has 2 points and plays less minutes than Danny Green. Now, I have been an advocate for Danny Green, and I feel like his role is really crucial because Doc loves veterans, and Danny Green is a veteran that Doc depends on and goes to and gives opportunities to. So I think, he's a great wild card. So is Shake Milton, but it's tough for me to figure out how Doc Rivers makes it work if he's not, showing the consistency as far as which guys get opportunities here as we go into the playoffs. So I said a lot, but I'm just thinking that if the Sixers are going to win, it has to come together here over these next 7 games and not continue to be a question mark in so many areas.
That would be the ideal outcome. I'll briefly say, I think the Bucks last year are a great example of why you don't stress the seeding too much. 2 years prior, they were the top seed in the Eastern Conference, disappointed in the playoffs. And then last year, of course, they win their first NBA title as the number 3 seed. And part of that is willingness to experiment and try different things during the regular season in terms of defensive flexibility and not relying so much on just one scheme and drop coverage, and kind of having more answers to what teams might throw at them in the playoffs. So in part for that general reason, I actually am not opposed to experimentation, but of course there's a fine line where you don't want to be just throwing everything at the wall and hoping something sticks. And I think the Sixers are not in a great place with that defensively. They are using so many different lineups and closing games differently in that 5th spot night after night. And even schematically, they've played a good amount of zone. They have some lineups where they switch a bunch. They have some where they're not comfortable doing so. They blitz some stars. They go straight up against some stars because they like Thybulle's ability to guard the perimeter scorer, or they like Harris. So there's just so much going on there. And you hear Tobias Harris be pretty upfront last night saying defensive communication was problematic in the 4th quarter of this game. And, I asked about whether that aspect is more difficult because of all this stuff they're trying. And he acknowledged it is, but he also thinks that's something they'll be able to overcome. And yet again, something they'll be able to figure out. So yeah, the number of challenges on this team's plate are large. And I think with Rivers last night, there are a lot of areas where you could criticize the calls he made. But of course, the most obvious one is how he handled the minutes behind Joel Embiid, and Paul Millsap just getting absolutely toasted by, the reigning finals MVP. Paul Millsap looked like a 37-year-old, and he, according to the NBA's tracking data, which isn't always on point, but gives you a decent idea of what happened. Giannis, in about 2 minutes, matched up against Millsap, scored 15 points on 7 for 10 shooting. So the reason the Sixers lost that game predominantly is because when Joel Embiid went off the court, Giannis was automatically scoring the basketball every single time down. So Rivers said they considered Paul Reed, who is 15 years the junior of Paul Millsap. And I think this is an example where it's fair to say Rivers' estimation of Reed was probably excessively harsh. Like he thought it was a tough matchup for him, and that kind of implied that Reed didn't fare so well the last time.
Right. Like, it wasn't a tough matchup for Paul Millsap the way he was
Right.
getting fried.
And I just think I just disagree that Paul Reed didn't do a decent job in that one game. It's, a shorthanded, weird matchup back in November, but we remember the highlight block and a little trash talk and some bravado there from Reed. And Rivers, after that particular game, said he thought he did a good job overall, but that he played him off to the side a little too much as opposed to just walling him off and preventing his ability to go downhill. But to me, that is nitpicking a little bit. And it was harsh to consider some of those minor flaws from Reed in that game as reason not to go with him last night. So Doc Rivers, his decision making overall with these close calls on who closes or who should play the wing minutes or what have you. That's a big question mark. And then just the backup center spot overall, it's not good right now. It's I think you said the NEM, the non-Embiid minutes. Last night was an illustration of how those can cost the Sixers games, even when their key players do a lot of good things. Tobias Harris was really strong on both ends in this game. Embiid and Harden overall had excellent performances, I think. And yet the team still lost because Paul Millsap played key minutes against Giannis, and that went absolutely catastrophically.
I got to break out the sad trombone for Doc Rivers for that third and fourth quarter of the non-Embiid minutes, and just that answer really. And I'll speak to that, but like that Price is Right sad trombone just rings in my ears because I just hear a little bit of that old man, I'm set in my ways, I know more than you do kind of arrogance from Doc Rivers when he says things like that, because he didn't want to play DeAndre Jordan because he thought that he wasn't, as versatile to be able to guard Giannis Antetokounmpo. We have seen, the bigs get, worked out a bit against the Lakers because they couldn't get out to the three-point line as quickly as maybe some of the younger guys like Paul Reed or what have you. But I just don't like the way it sounds like Doc feels like he knows more than everyone else. And not that, we're like, his, silent partners that are like filling him in on, the details, and he's going out there and executing the plan. But just the eye test tells you that Paul Millsap was getting fried. Joel Embiid and Harden weren't on the floor. The lead was dissipating, but there's no timeout to like slow the roll of the Bucks. There's no adjustment at that time to try to get somebody on the floor who you felt like would guard Giannis a little tougher. And that's that arrogance of kind of being set in your ways and not really being open to different ideas. And they have an all-star cast of assistant coaches, really just guys who may not even be here next season because of other opportunities that might pop up or what have you. But when I hear Doc Rivers say stuff like that, it just makes me feel like he's just willing to go down with the ship. Like, this is what I thought. I went with my idea. It didn't work, but oh well. And we've seen him in the past, of course, with the LA Clippers, lose in fantastic fashion in ways where the other team comes back from an unbelievable deficit. We've seen these blown leads from the Sixers. He's given up 3-1 leads in the postseason. So I don't like hearing those things from him. And particularly, last night, if you sub out Paul Millsap for DeAndre Jordan, I think that's ideally, the 9 players that did play, that's ideally what we might see come the postseason. It seems like Shake Milton has risen to the top in that, hierarchy of the bench players. And of course, Danny Green and George Niang are going to get minutes because of their shooting prowess and catch and shoot ability and veteran leadership, which Doc Rivers loves. But and maybe leaning on Paul Reed in a playoff situation isn't the smart thing to do. But I don't know it unless I see it. And just taking Doc Rivers' word for it, I don't quite feel as comfortable with that. Just him saying, I know more than you, and this is the way it should be. And Paul Millsap being out there was the best thing for the team. So, sometimes it just feels that way to me. I don't know. I mean, tell me I'm wrong.
Not going to do that. No, I think there is undoubtedly some inflexibility just with how he approaches the game, and there's a high level of trust that his gut feel is good, and he's been through a lot of stuff, and he's going to make the right decisions. And obviously,
but has he learned from the loss? You know what I'm saying? Has he learned from those instances where that didn't work out in the past and this season? Like, I want to see the visual evidence of him having learned. And I don't mean to cut you off, but it just kind of sticks, kind of.
No, I hear you. Yeah, and the playoffs is the ultimate test, but some of the pre-playoff indicators are obviously not great here. Just hearing you talk about going down with this ship, I got a little flashback to the final days of the Brett Brown era. And I remember asking about why Horford started. There was some back and forth in that playoff series against Boston with Horford and Thibault. And Brett Brown had a memorable quote, "We trusted his resume." Essentially, there weren't any great basketball reasons for continuing to lean heavily on Al Horford and Joel Embiid on the floor together, but the Sixers made a large investment in that. Al Horford had a lot of NBA experience, and that's kind of the way it was. I don't think the Sixers this year are in such a bad spot where they need to lean on a bad fit sort of player for key minutes. But the backup center situation continues to not be remotely encouraging in any way, both in terms of the options and then in terms of how those options are being used. I think with Reed, of course, there's just the pregame decision of, are you going with him or are you giving him a chance here? But then I wholeheartedly agree with your point of when things are going downhill, why not just pull the plug and try something different in that spot? Try to stop the bleeding a little bit. So yeah, I think overall, on paper, the Sixers seem less likely to blow big playoff leads because this team doesn't turn the ball over as much as last year's and has two great guys at drawing free throws. Joel Embiid's gotten a little bit better, of course, and his passing and decision making perhaps will lead to less of the costly turnovers and transition defense problems, etc. But yeah, the coaching is a factor when you blow big leads, and Doc Rivers' resume there is not a good one. So you don't want to, I think, overstate his flaws and completely ignore the fact that players think really highly of him. And he does have the Sixers in a good spot, despite them being in an unenviable situation with Ben Simmons for most of this year. And he's done a lot of good things for this basketball team, indisputably, but there are playoff-specific concerns related to how he will coach this team and coach the backup center spot. That's just the unfortunate reality that was, of course, highlighted glaringly last night.
Sixers get big-time performances from their best players, although Embiid did start slow. Harden has his first 30-point game ever as a 76er. And at the same time, I'm wondering why, you look at both of these last two games, you have, the great performance in the first half and then a sloppy performance in the second half of the 76ers where they give up 67 points to the Bucks. And then in Phoenix, they have a better defensive second half, but still lose. You know what I'm saying? The transition defense was better. They kept the Suns under 120 points, but then they come here against the Bucks and the defense is gone. And I think that inconsistency speaks to, definitely a flaw or areas of concern or things they need to get better at, but also that, teams who are, like you look at what the Phoenix Suns were able to do without Chris Paul, teams like the Memphis Grizzlies without their stars, and it's just the teams that are better or title contenders have more consistent success and don't show those inconsistencies between games in those specific ways. Like your defense is good one game, but it's bad another. And you're whereas, you come home where you feel like you should be more of a fortress, and the Sixers haven't had the success at home that they've had in the past, but yet they defense lapse or there's a mental, disconnect where they aren't what they should be, So I'm looking at these last two games and I'm like, well, how come the transition defense is better, yet they can't carry that over to this game? You know what I mean? So I'm hoping they can figure these things out and wishing, and I think everyone's, seeing a lot of the same things, but I don't know if the coaching staff is, as focused on some of those things as others. But
yeah, I wouldn't fully agree with the idea that all good teams are far more consistent than the Sixers. The Sixers have won 4 straight before this and held double-digit leads in both these games. And also, like if you look at the Milwaukee Bucks, the game before this, they lost to the Grizzlies by 25, and they have been trying to reincorporate Brook Lopez, who missed the majority of this year with a back injury. The Sixers only have 15 games with James Harden in the lineup. So to me, these are all relevant factors to consider, and undeniably, the team does not have a strong identity or sense of if we do X, Y, and Z, we're going to consistently win every night. But I don't think they are ridiculously unique in that regard, or that that particular problem is inevitably going to be a fatal playoff flaw. But yeah, clearly not in a good spot when it comes to what you're getting from this team. And I think James Harden's performances exemplify that, right? I mean, he was 0 for 11 or 2 for 11 against Phoenix, almost not an 0 for, but not a good night. And he's had a few of those: 3 for 17 against Brooklyn, 4 for 19 or something along those lines against Orlando. So sure, part of that is just game-to-game shooting variance, but James Harden, ideally the Sixers want some sense of there's efficiency every night, and there's going to be aggression, and that just we know the way he's going to play. And I don't think that's been the case. Last night, Doc Rivers thought it was a big step in the right direction with him focusing on scoring and just not worrying too much about the facilitating, figuring that would be a natural byproduct of him driving to the rim and playing an aggressive style. So we'll see if that's the case. We'll see if the Sixers can build on that a little bit, and Harden can enter the playoffs playing the type of basketball that the Sixers need him to. Again, I'll note the final 7 games, 6-1, 7-0. Like, it's very possible. Quite possible this team enters the postseason feeling good about itself, and with some not especially difficult tests in which they can, hit on answers in less stressful environments than contenders, have put them under these last 2.
Hey, hopefully Joel can rest the back. Other guys can rest their ailing injuries as this regular season comes to a close. No, I just don't want to be doing this podcast at the end of the season and reflecting on a playoff blown lead, a bad coaching mistake, similar to what we had last year with the Hawks coming back from incredible deficit to, turn the tide in that series, or just inconsistencies or things that didn't play out the way we expected, because we saw them here in the regular season, and then they just came to pass in the postseason. And so I think I'm just hung up on a little bit of the Doc Rivers failed timeouts, or juggling the lineup there when Giannis had Millsap in the frying pan, or going to, like Embiid said after the game, matching up the minutes. Like you could have, when Giannis is on the floor, put Embiid on the floor, or Harden, or however you want to, pull the matchups. But I really think that there's room for them to get this right, but it's going to be matchup based, and I think that that'll be easier for the coaching staff in the playoffs because they're playing the same team. So there's not the night to night differences of skill sets or how a team plays or whatnot. You can game plan against one team and make some of those adjustments like that. So I think that those things might come easier in the playoffs, but I just hope that they don't get in their own way, and I don't want to come back here and have to rehash that.
Yeah, I hear where you're coming from. I think on one hand, coaching and game planning is easier in the playoffs because it's a series, but on the other, it is costly when your initial decisions aren't right. Think back to the Hawks series, beginning with Danny Green on Trae Young, backfired and was a large reason the Sixers lost game one of that series, which ended up going 7 games. Not to say that was an indefensible call, but it's one that is high stakes and the type of thing that a coaching staff has to get right. But yeah, the head coach will be in the spotlight, and that's already the case. They'll be magnified even a little bit more, and we'll see how he performs. I even think back to last year during that Bucks Nets series, just there being very intense criticism of Mike Budenholzer, and I think a perception that if Milwaukee didn't get it done against a Nets team with a hampered James Harden and not at full strength, that he would lose his job. He ends up squeaking by because his stars were awesome, and he wins an NBA title. So the very
Kevin
fine
Durant's feet. Let's not forget that.
Kevin Durant's feet. Mike Budenholzer probably is thankful for that large shoe size. So yeah, fine margins in the playoffs, and a lot of it's on the coaching, a lot of it's on the stars. But yeah, there's not a ton of reasons to be confident that Rivers is going to nail all those finer decisions. But it's not all in his hands, of course. A lot of shared responsibility here, and a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure on everyone involved, from Daryl Morey to Joel Embiid to a big money player like Tobias Harris. And we'll see how the Sixers handle that. For me, right now, just the main, lingering issue is what James Harden are they going to get? I think there's so much variability here, as he's already showed us, and the Sixers would prefer that not to be the case and to feel like they understand who he is, but I'm not too sure. Really good last night. I think he reminded us that he was a deserving All-Star in 10 straight seasons. And if he is that in the playoffs, that is highly, highly significant and means that, these championship ambitions are in play for the Sixers.
I want to table some of the Harden talk for after this timeout, but I mean, you could do this with both sides. I think if you're from the Sixers perspective, it was a 2-point game. Maxey has probably one of his worst games of the season, going 3 of 11. If he makes 4 more shots, 2 more shots, 1 more shot, maybe that being a 3-pointer, they would have won the game. You could do that on both sides, but him not playing his best didn't help the Sixers at all last night, even though they got great game from Tobias, great game from Harden, and Embiid was his usual self. And the bench wasn't bad. They weren't great, spectacular, but they weren't bad. So they don't have to worry about that being the thing you point to for last night. But I think Doc Rivers, you mentioned a hot seat with Budenholzer. I think Doc Rivers, the way this regular season played out and how disjointed it was with the Simmons stuff, and that he was able to overcome that, only having Joel Embiid for the lion's share of the season. I think that kind of saves his job, even though the playoffs are going to be really important, as long as, if they get to a game 7 in the second round and end up falling, I think he comes back next season, but I think he's on a short leash then. But I think how this regular season played out probably saves his job. But I'm just looking for a little bit of the man in the mirror stuff with Doc Rivers because it does come down to guys making shots, like I mentioned with Maxey, and ultimately it is the players. But you can't, like I said, to get out of your own way, you can't be shooting yourself in the foot, putting all bench lineups out there. You can't be shooting yourself in the foot, just having Paul Millsap or some player at a disadvantage and the lead dwindle and you not, really, try to turn the tide in a way that is outside of what's obvious, I guess. But sometimes the obvious is fine. So if obviously getting Paul Millsap out of there and get Paul Reed in or whoever, but I really felt like an athletic guy with energy is better than 37-year-old Paul Millsap. But Doc Rivers knows more than all of us, right? So
yeah, he's done and accomplished a lot more than all of us. No arguing with that. Yeah, I will say it was a low bar to clear as far as doing the obvious correct thing, but DeAndre Jordan was out of the rotation after 11 straight games. And seeing Millsap at the scorers table, I personally had a little bit of surprise initially, like, wow, DeAndre is not playing in this one when it really
and I was surprised he wasn't using those fouls. Like, get aggressive on Giannis. You know what I'm saying? Stop him from send him to the line. Stop him from getting those easy points.
Although that's one potential route. I thought, at least at a basic level, the logic of Paul Millsap moves better than DeAndre Jordan, and you need some movement ability against Giannis was sound, but clearly no one's equipped to guard Giannis that well, but Millsap would not rank highly among the players.
Trying to play good defense and then complaining to the ref when you get called for a whistle. That's not going to – Paul Millsap, you're not getting – this isn't 10 years ago, 7 years ago. You know what I'm saying? You're not getting that benefit of the doubt. But let's take a quick timeout after this. Go ahead. Make your last point. We'll take
I'll just say, I mean, I understand Millsap being frustrated in that spot and being a competitive guy. And I think that played out as badly as it could have for him and the team. Again, not a good decision, the wrong call. Reed clearly was the way to go there. But
then for Rivers to stand up there and act as if that wasn't, Joel Embiid at the podium says that the game, swung when he was out of the game and Paul Millsap or Giannis was scoring all those points consecutively. But then, Doc Rivers acts like that's not where the game swung.
He certainly didn't fixate on it. He at least, briefly explains his decision and, didn't want to say much more about it. And everything looked a lot worse because Giannis was making pull-up jumpers and 3 balls and turnarounds in the post.
And then he brings a dad joke notebook to the podium afterward. He's sitting on the logo previously. I like the guy, but still, it pains me for those things.
He shined on a big stage last night in this MVP race. Maybe he throws himself into it a little more convincingly here. He's obviously had a great season as well and has Milwaukee right up there in the East despite missing Lopez most of the year. I think, last night was another entertaining reminder that if Embiid doesn't win this award, like there are other guys that would be deserving, as much as that would infuriate many Sixers fans. Great player, and he looks even greater when he gets to face Paul Millsap.
We're going to take a time out on the Sixers Talk podcast. Right back with more. I've been tiptoeing around this Harden stuff. Some really interesting comments after the game. We'll see what Noah thinks about it. And be sure to check out his observations and all of his work on NBCSportsPhiladelphia.com. We'll be right back with a lot more. Stay with us. All right. You ready?
Yep.
All right. 3, 2. Noah, we both have played basketball, absolutely not at the pro level, and college either. But it's kind of weird to wrap your head around the idea that James Harden has played a style of basketball, bro, for so long that feels unorthodox shooting catch and shoot jumpers. Like you would think that that's just like something everybody does. You know what I'm saying? But he has played such a ball dominant, top 75 Hall of Fame style of basketball that catch and shoot jumpers are a little unorthodox to him. So he talks, after the game about this discussion that him and Doc Rivers had for about a half hour before, on the day of the game. And Doc just really, trying to hammer home to him that, hey, we know you're trying to get other guys involved and incorporate people, but the aggressive James Harden is going to benefit this team a lot more than maybe the, playmaking style that he was playing in Brooklyn along with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. And he, Doc Rivers mentioned the catch and shoot thing, and James elaborated on that, saying, there's like a swing, and like I'm the guy to take the shot because it's a catch and shoot jumper, but I'm not used to that, so sometimes I pass those shots up. And I think there even the non-catch and shoot stuff, I've seen opportunities or daylight that he's had that he's decided he wouldn't shoot the ball. I even thought that before the step back jumper he shot that he missed against Robin Lopez at the end of the game, there seemed to be a moment where Lopez was sagging back a little bit thinking that he would drive, and he had an open look without a step back. It was just, he could have just rise and fire type of thing. So this thing is a work in progress. You mentioned it's been 15 games. They're still trying to work through some of these kinks and iron some things out. So, I started the podcast talking about the fact that there could be light at the end of this tunnel where they do have the transparency to dissect these fourth quarters from these last two games and really look at the minutia and figure some things out and practice. And James said he's looking at tape to find these little nuances and things like that. So there is, this transparency with them at the podium, with the media telling us the things that they need to work on and that they're not so good at. And I think that's kind of why I kind of ding Doc Rivers a bit, because Joel's being transparent, James is being transparent, but he's not really saying I, need to be better. But interesting comments from Harden, and I would love to have been a fly on the wall in that room when they were having the discussion. But I thought that was really weird, as from a basketball standpoint of, guys are taught to, stand by the 3-point line with their hands up or, be ready to receive the ball. But to him, getting the ball and shooting it is a little weird, just while he's standing there. So,
right, understandably, yeah. I'll first just say that was Brooke Lopez. Robin is the one with the bigger, more
that wrestles mascots. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Two smart Stanford guys, but right. One is more noticeable because of the hair. Yeah.
Thank you for correcting that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think Harden, it makes a ton of sense that he has to reprogram himself a little bit and isn't as comfortable in that role. And it's another spot where some of it's obvious, like you're wide open, no one's around, you shoot the ball. But some of it's 50-50. I can remember one instance where he had a guy closing out on him, and it probably would have been a pretty open shot, but he instead made the quote-unquote extra pass to Harris in the corner, and Harris got a wide-open corner three. Harris makes that, everyone's happy, and isn't complaining that Harden's instinct there was to be a little unselfish and not immediately let it fly. So we'll see how quickly he can figure that out. I have noticed, he works with Sam Cassell quite regularly after the shoot-arounds and the practices, and they do incorporate the catch and shoot. It's not just off the dribble, the way it probably would have been if he was in another situation or on another team that required something different from him. I think there's also some details to work through here just of how they want to situate themselves around Joel Embiid in the post, right? Like, if the opponent
do you like Harden on the strong side?
It depends who he's sharing the court with, but I think overall, Of course, you
I'm saying, but
prefer.
okay, you mean other guys like if Niang or Danny Green or whoever is
Right.
on the
So
court. I
yeah,
got you.
those are
Okay.
the two that come to mind for me as they are willing and high level catch and shoot players. Uh, so I think you gotta sort of diagnose what the defense is throwing at you, and if the double is indeed coming just on the strong side dig down, then James Harden probably isn't your best option
Mm.
in that scenario. But as you said, that those are the kind of things you learn through film and you learn through experience. I think there's no reason that James Harden can't be an efficient and somewhat willing catch and shoot player, but it wouldn't be realistic also to expect dramatic development in a very short period of time here. Uh, what's most important is for him to be aggressive with his drives and with his pick and roll play, and also for him and Embiid to continue to fine tune those pick and roll nuances of what they do when an opposing team switches the big onto Harden, what they do against blitzes, against drop, against all these looks that are most definitely going to be thrown his way. But it is kind of ironic because, of course, Embiid and Harden as well have been very strong, vocal public advocates this year for the guys around them need to let it fly. And that's also the case with James Harden.
Right.
When Joel Embiid kicks the ball out to him, that's usually going to be the best option. And we'll see if he can trend a little more in that direction of firing it a little more often. But yeah, it's definitely a little strange. I agree with you in seeing it that way.
Interesting, man. And you know, you talk about switching guys on the strong side, and the outlet pass and the safety valve, and things like that. But to me, that's obviously something the coaching can help with is spacing on the floor, which guys are where. We've seen Joel Embiid direct traffic at certain times when he has the basketball, and we've seen James be vocal in that way too. And I'm just, it seems like there's another level that they need to reach that I don't know if they're going to be able to reach that next level. And I'm not saying next level as in competitiveness or winning mentality or any of that stuff, just another level of in syncness that maybe, would obviously come with the off season and training camp and all that stuff. But they just don't have as much time or practice opportunities to iron out some of these things. But it's really going to be interesting how that comes, takes shape here over these last 7 games. And as we go into the first season, a matchup with the Bulls to try and figure some of these things out, I'm really comfortable with that. Matchup with the Cavs to try to continue to figure some of these things out, I'm comfortable with. Doing that against the Celtics, probably the Nets, the Bucks, Heat, I'm not comfortable with that. It just that would, to me, would spell their demise in some ways, because I feel like those teams would smell blood in the water with some of those inconsistencies and the execution stuff.
That's fair enough. I think overall, outside of, I guess, arguably the Nets, because they made the big trade with the Sixers, all the other teams in the East are further along with understanding the nuances of how to play with each other and having answers for, okay, defenses like doing these things against us, and here are responses we found, that are effective against those strategies. I think also, I was talking about adjustments and that being important both internally with players and then also, of course, the coaching in a playoff series. But like very good teams and coaches are proactive, so they predict what's going to come and they make the opponent uncomfortable. And I'm not too encouraged that the Sixers are going to be in a great spot with that general area just because they're looking inward so much. They're just trying to figure out, like, okay, how do we get Harden on the right spots on the floor? How do we develop this pick and roll? And maybe aren't as advanced with thinking about little tricky ways that they can beat other teams. For instance, we were talking about the spacing around Embiid. For specific opponents, the Sixers will be able to look at the tape and say, okay, Giannis has been used as the Roman defender, and he's been on Thibault. And we've seen that when Thibault makes the cut, that's sometimes opened up, the weak side pass for Embiid, the skip pass to the opposite wing. So, okay, we want our best catch and shoot guy in that spot. I think they'll be aware of that sort of stuff, but I'm not sure they'll be able to go the next step of, all right, so we think that Milwaukee is going to tweak this, and then when they do that, we are going to have this as our plan C. Those sort of high-level coaching decisions, there's reason to be skeptical there. Both one, just for the reasons you have laid out of Doc Rivers' track record, and then two, because he's not working with a team that has played together a ton and has discovered what works best for them. That's just the reality of it. 15 games with James Harden, it's just not much time. And I don't think many coaches would feel that comfortable about their ability to coach proactively. So the Sixers probably are going to have to be somewhat reactive. And then, in my mind, you nailed it with the reactions have to be the obvious correct ones, so this isn't working, like, you got to pull the plug.
Yeah, a good coach, man, a good veteran coach like Doc Rivers should account for a few wins. He should make a difference in a few situations. How about if we go back to last year's playoffs, the DeAndre Ayton alley-oop buzzer beater that they had in the playoffs, that Monty Williams drew up that play from Brett Brown. I want to see hopefully some of those type of things, particularly out of timeouts. There were a couple of out of timeouts last night, definitely down the stretch where the execution wasn't quite there. They didn't get a great pick. Joel didn't on the pick and roll to kind of take that man out of the play. It just, credit to Milwaukee for, hedging some of those things and, jumping in the passing lanes and things like that. But, a good coach should definitely account for some wins. And you could say that Doc delivered that in the time without Ben Simmons and coaching this team, to top four in the standings during that time. But last thought, Noah, before we get out of here, anything that we didn't get to?
Yeah, just for the sake of fairness, I will note that Rivers' ability to have a candid 30-minute discussion with his star that player seemingly takes to heart, that's a major positive and probably shouldn't be ignored in our view of him as a coach. Remember at James Harden's press conference, he considered Rivers one of the best coaches of all time. Obviously, many people who write about the game or watch the Sixers don't hold that same view, but a star believing that to be true and listening and wanting to learn from that coach is highly significant and is a major plus in Doc Rivers' corner. It doesn't make all the other negative stuff that we've touched on irrelevant, but
both things can be true at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's a key part of the big picture of who he is. And frankly, if Brett Brown was still the coach of this team, it's hard to imagine a similar thing unfolding where an open discussion would be held, with the same level of mutual respect. So small reason for encouragement just when it comes to making these stars play their best. And that's what the Sixers are most likely going to need. There's no guarantee it'll be enough because maybe the NEM go really badly in a series, or maybe the bench is inconsistent, or maybe the defense never settles on reliable schemes, or the opposing coach makes better adjustments. All these are valid concerns, but If the Sixers stars are at their top level and working well together, that's number one. And the ceiling to me remains legitimately high if that's the case. And I wasn't dissuaded at all from that view from what I saw in these two games. I think they showed there's the ability and just the natural talent level to beat great teams. But of course, the playoffs are about doing so 4 times over 7 games, and that will be the ultimate test.
7 games left in this regular season, a back-to-back this weekend, Saturday, Sunday, one more left. You heard Noah talk about how easy the schedule is. Maybe 6-1, maybe 7-0 here as we wrap things up. But looks like we're looking at a Monday, Wednesday podcast schedule for next week, so we will rejoin you then. Hey, everyone, enjoy the rest of the week. We got Detroit tomorrow, so a road game that should be a check mark in the win column, but the Sixers jockeying for position here in the Eastern Conference race that will come down to the wire. So it will be interesting nonetheless. But for Noah Levick, I'm Danny Pommells, Ben Berry, our producer, who we appreciate as always. Thank you for listening to the Sixers Talk podcast brought to you by Wilmington University. WilMU Works. We will see you next time.